representatives of ALINE ministries, donor agencies, and members of LIFT and implementing partners. I hope you can all hear me easily. I wanted to talk about capacity, institutional management, interconnectivity, because my hope is that I can work towards some thoughts on building a knowledge platform for agriculture and rural development, focusing on evidence-based learning and results-based management for Myanmar. As we all know, the timing is opportune. The government's focus on the reforms introduced and LIFT's alignment through its new strategy provide an opportune time to look at how we work together as a group of organisations in facilitating change. Just to remind you very briefly, the Livelihoods Food Security and Trust Fund LIFT has a collective and influential voice for innovation and learning. Its intention is to provide a platform for enhanced policy engagement on sustainable agriculture and food security and rural development. Its purpose is to increase livelihoods, resilience and nutrition of poor people in Myanmar by focusing on interventions that increase income, food availability, utilization and stability of access to food. It will achieve its purpose by enabling the following program outcomes. As you can see on the stage, we have a series of 4 overall outcomes. These include increasing incomes of rural households, increasing resilience of poor rural households and communities to shocks, stresses and adverse trends, improved nutrition of women, men and children, and improved policies and effective public expenditure for pro-poor rural development. In your bags, you will have seen a leaflet that gives you a little bit of an insight into the sorts of results that LIFT has been able to achieve by 2014. 91 active and completed project grants, working with more than 50 implementing partners. Thank you. 50 implementing partners in over half of the townships in Myanmar. The assistance has reached 2.5 million people, around 5% of the population, and 290,000 beneficiary households have increased their food security. It's important also to focus on the expenditure over that period of time. And so I think the President of the European Union yesterday mentioned a figure of about $250 million. As somebody involved in knowledge management and results, one wants to start looking at the efficiencies of the sorts of results that one is being able to secure in light of that level of expenditure. What I'd like to do today is to just run through some ideas with you. I hope that you will be in a position to raise questions, to be critical about whether a knowledge platform might work for you. I'm going to focus a little bit on knowledge management and the role of monitoring and evaluation. I'm going to tell you about some of the features that are important in a knowledge platform. I'm going to focus on what a learning agenda is in terms of focusing the knowledge and the questions within such a platform, the role of a results framework, a theory of change approach, and external evaluations and research studies. I hope to be able to illustrate to you what I think a digital knowledge portal looks like, and to enable better evidence-based learning. So just to give you a little bit of a clarity on the definitions, monitoring and evaluation generally focuses on the interpretation of outputs, outcomes and impacts of a particular intervention. It's very much about the data itself, and it emerges from the accountability paradigm. Knowledge management, however, is a resource. It focuses on how knowledge is produced and shared, how it might be lost or misused, in diverse institutional settings. It also is about people, their relationships, and what they can do with data. and emerges from the learning and performance paradigm. And so clearly these two things really need to work in tandem to create a knowledge management system. It's very important to know that these two things are complementary and yet different. M&E is generally the foundation for primary evidence around the extent to which an intervention is achieving what it's set out to achieve. Knowledge management ensures that the data gets translated into learning and captures new understandings and ways of working in service of strategic goals. So the whole concept of to what extent is an intervention working in, and is that intervention scalable, replicable, sustainable, are all components of how you use data as part of knowledge management. In relation to LIFT's new strategy in 2014, there will be intended positive consequences. There will also be unintended positive consequences, as well as unintended negative consequences. And there will be a need for evaluation of an independent nature to verify the sorts of results and findings that LIFT is able to share. But all of the combination of these things will be to test whether or not the LIFT strategy is fundamentally working. And since the LIFT strategy focuses on transforming the rural development sector, it is in our common interest that we sort of understand some of the trends and patterns and models that are working in that context. More generally, the knowledge platform should support performance management at the level of the implementation partners, at the level of the programs and the fund management itself, and other partners in the mix to understand what's working and why. To be able to produce communications that are targeted and allow us to understand what sorts of returns we should be able to expect from the levels of our investments, to push that envelope in opportunities where we might, and to look particularly at accountability through the provision of robust evidence to help us to make better decisions. There are internal components that are very important for how knowledge platform works, and external ones. So in relation to the internal ones, the key implementing partners and internal stakeholders should be engaged in an evidence-based learning process. The systematic M&E framework should be in place to allow them to see how they are engaged and what their role is in that process. And it should also attempt to build capacity and skills of implementing partners to learn from each other and to improve their performance in line with LIFT objectives. Government should also be involved to some extent inside, so that it has a clear view of the quality of the evidence and the learning coming out of the internal processes of LIFT. At the same time, a broader network of development partners, particularly the government, but also donors and implementing organisations outside of LIFT, should be engaged in that learning process. There should be agendas that allow participation, that allow a lot of different communities of practice and working group meetings to review and discuss and debate choices and decisions that are guided by others. And a key attribute is to emphasize the external actors are an integral part of that learning process and have ownership of the evidence produced. When looking at complex sectoral change initiatives, it's really important that everybody understands their role in that process. So in order to have a platform that works effectively in those capacities, you need a mechanism for interlinked learning agendas. These have got to be credible at the sector level, at the theme level, and I'll say a little bit more about this in the context of LIFT, in terms of geographic spread, and in terms of the livelihood strategy being pursued, and I will say a little bit more about that in a minute. We also want to look at a variety of mechanisms for generating robust evidence. Mostly those pieces of evidence need to be compiled in such a way that they are self-reinforcing and mutually reinforcing. And we need to focus on mechanisms for synthesis, storing, sharing, and integrating evidence into activities and into decisions. Let me try and walk you through this, because you may have a little bit of difficulty reading it from where you're sitting. In order to define a learning agenda, as I mentioned earlier, there are three components, or rather two components. There is content, dictated by some of the cross-cutting themes as part of LIFT, livelihood strategies, and so if any of you have read the LIFT strategy, there are three types of livelihood strategies which may be embedded in particular regional programs or in projects. Those are hanging in, stepping up, and stepping out. So in any one region, we may have a number of different livelihood strategies that are facilitated by different kinds of programs. At the same time, we need to have clarity on evidence about what's working, to what extent, through which mechanisms, and under what contextual conditions. Tom in his presentation yesterday highlighted the differential costs of labour, for example, for monsoon rice. That's an interesting contextual difference that will affect very much the efficacy of some of these livelihood strategies. So how do we wrap all of that up into four key outcomes, the ones that are here on this stage, and a series of intermediate outcomes that have been assembled by LIFT as part of its historic understanding of the kind of change some of these initiatives produce. So I'm going to recap that for you just to make it very clear. The evidence needs to be organized by thematic area, different strategy of livelihood, so hanging in, stepping up, stepping out, the geographic region, different types of users that the evidence can serve. The focus is on identifying what worked and to what extent, and the challenges faced in different contexts. Again, these would take the form of a series of case studies of specific interventions, compilations of lessons learned by implementing partners through their M&E and consolidated through communities of practice, routine monitoring data collected by implementing partners, workshops and thematic workshops, and external evaluations and studies. And really, the reason I want to flag those is because some of you, having been in the marketplace yesterday, may have felt somewhat inundated by the quantity of published materials. If you wanted to know which of the combination of 20 initiatives outside were working and to what extent, you would probably need a couple of weeks to go through most of those documents. So how can we make that process a little more efficient? In relation to the M&E, there are internal monitoring and evaluation and research priorities, mainly the responsibility of the internal management of LIFT and the implementing partners. And there are external research and evaluation priorities, which may be more in the domain of internal management, governments, donors, part of a governmental system-wide M&E framework and learning agenda, and part of sort of theories of change, both at the programmatic level and at the initiative level. And we can go into more detail there. So in order to get the monitoring and evaluation priorities right, a results framework is necessary to understand for each intervention, both at the program level, the theme level, and the livelihood strategy level, what the activities, outputs, outcomes are, and to use it as a performance measurement tool as part of a learning process. A theory of change principally articulates a common vision of change for a system. It defines the actors and their roles, how they contribute to specific outcomes, and identifies those contextual factors that shape the process. It also allows you to be explicit about your assumptions. Every strategy has assumptions, every theory of change has assumptions, and it allows you to test whether they are playing out effectively. The principle is very simple. The terminology very often confuses people, but the principle is very simple. Let me just run through it for you. So, if we are at the program level, we have a series of activities which we expect to lead to a series of outcomes, but there are certain conditions by which they will do that. For example, if we provide information through an extension service to a farmer, we expect that the farmer will understand that information on condition that he is both literate, that he is able to access the information, that he is in the right place at the right time to be able to engage, etc., etc. Those individuals may in turn create an outcome that leads to a practice, the adoption of a new variety, the adoption of crop management techniques that increase their efficiency and effectiveness, and that would then lead to something like improved productivity, for example. Traditionally, for NGOs involved in assisting farmers in rural development, they have control over this part of the process. You are then in the area where you can influence these actors, but you do not have control over them. And by the time you come to a system, you are one small component in a big, dynamic and complex system. And so you have very little control, but you have a lot of interest. And it's very important that we understand that it's our relationship with these partners that dictates how successful we are here. For LIFT, we have a vision, as I mentioned, an influential voice for innovation and learning, and to provide a platform for enhanced policy engagement. The purpose of LIFT is to contribute to sustainably reduce the number of people in Myanmar living in poverty and hunger. And the goal is to increase income and nutrition of 2.5 million people by focusing on interventions that increase food availability, utilization and stability and access to food. That's the theory of change at the LIFT initiative level. In relation to the outcomes that is seeking to achieve, as I mentioned, there are here on the stage: increased incomes, increased resilience, improved nutrition of women, men and children, and improved policies. But there are a number of intermediate outcomes, which are the sorts of outcomes that LIFT measures at the program level. And finally, there are 3 livelihood strategies, 3 approaches. You're saying in any one region we could employ interventions that allow the population, the communities to hang in there, to continue to farm more efficiently, to continue to meet their food security needs, or we could allow them to create some economic advantage to the activities that they are pursuing and allow them to step up, reinvest in their farms, perhaps pursue some off-farm work, and eventually to be in a position to create a balance between on-farm and off-farm, or even move into other sectors. So if we put those 3 things together, it's important that you see that they are all self-reinforcing. At some point we have to create an accountability tool for reporting, but a planning tool for testing these program-level strategies and for organizing evidence to support our understanding of how this change happens. At the same time, beneath that we have a program-level theory of change. Again, by using a series of different interventions, you could have the same interventions in one program, or you could have different programs with different, creating knowledge for farmers, allowing farmers to access, for example, inputs, enabling farmers to change their behavior and adopt new practices, and then create these outcomes related to productivity, improved food security, and so on. These programs would differ by theme, and the knowledge platform needs to be able to capture this information, particularly to underpin this people-centered approach, to be able to understand how it contributes to those higher outcomes. Again, putting it together, you've got your high-level outcomes, the 4 that are on the stage, that are part of LIFT as an overall initiative, and you've got individual programs that have their own theory of change exchange and a series of initiatives that are funded by or implemented by different implementing partners, where a common set of indicators are used to populate aggregation against certain outcomes. Again, we have a series of thematic areas, and we have these two components: building the capacity of implementing partners to do better data collection, to understand how they contribute to outcomes at the program level and outcomes at the rural development sector level. Just to give you, so in order to underpin all this internal work, there should be some external commissioned evaluations to verify this independently, to ensure that individual implementing partners contribute to specific program outputs and outcomes through their activities, and they carry out routine M&E in a systematic manner that allows the aggregation through these common indicators to begin to give us an overall picture of what's happening in terms of moving the needle at the sectoral level. It's really important that robust internal M&E by implementing partners provides evidence about what works and what doesn't, and the conditions under which that's possible, so the contextual factors. In terms of those people who want information, who want access to information, want to use that information, there are a whole series of stakeholders and partners: the government, international and national NGOs, the UN agencies, notwithstanding UN, some of the international organizations we mentioned, URI and their work on rice, academic and research institutions in country and in the region, sectoral working groups, and lastly I would say donors, because really it's a combination of the activities of all these people who create scale, and that's really what we're trying to focus on. Again, going into a little bit more detail here: stepping out, stepping up, hanging in. These are three sets of livelihood strategies in different colours that might be employed in different regional programs or in different programs themselves. So what we might say, as we mentioned yesterday, we talked about Rakhine province, it might be more challenging to be able to move from stepping up to stepping out. But maybe the focus is going to be on trying to find ways to graduate people who are hanging in to those that might be stepping up, for example. And we want to know, in that mix, what are the models that are working, how are they working, to what extent are they working, and what are the factors driving them in order to be able to replicate that elsewhere. The evidence-based learning doesn't just happen like that. What's really important is that some of this preparation lays a very systematic approach to it. The agendas are at different levels. The internal and external M&E have a shared framework, and an online knowledge portal is probably the best way to allow people access to this material. In addition, this part of the material, really principally for a lot of the implementing partners in the room, is critical. Creating learning mechanisms and events to allow a wider network of knowledge users to not only shape practice and learning agendas, but to benefit from them. So I think this is just to reiterate my last point. We've got to have processes that sit between the data collection itself and the use of knowledge products. And that is really related to the fact that a knowledge management system is a living ecosystem. It is not just a repository for documents. It is more about facilitating learning processes around the quality of evidence and data that is collected, understanding collectively what's working, what's not, when, how, and ensuring that we can learn from those processes and course correct where necessary at all of these different levels. So if we were to put these components together in a knowledge platform, and this starts to work towards a portal, we have to start thinking about our stakeholders, which engage at various parts of the system in different capacities. Remember, in relation to the implementing partners who are doing projects, some of which are working in specific regions. There is local government and national NGOs who are critical and key in order to understand scalability, sustainability in those regions. There are a number of different thematic areas through which those programs have been supported by LIFT. And there are some livelihood strategies that may also cross-cut some of that. You're trying different approaches in different areas to move people through a graduated system of improvement so that they reach a point where they can reinvest in their agricultural systems, or they can create a whole cadre of other enterprises that support agricultural systems but also connect them to urban centres. Tom mentioned transporters, processors, value addition people, marketers, packagers. All of those people are all part of a vibrant rural economy. Again, we want to know what's working and where, and we want to know how that contributes to looking at change by using specific indicators that can be aggregated. An online repository should be able to provide evidence by outcomes, thematic areas, the strategies and pathways, geography, and the types of user or users. This is more of an ICT piece to understand who wants the information, who needs access to the information, and what kinds of capacities they have to be able to download information, view information, and so on. It also talks about content, progress against outcomes, synthesis of lessons learned, what's working and why, insights into learning agendas and answering questions about to what extent are these strategies effective in this environment, and it is underpinned by some external work that verifies the self-reporting that this system supports. So you should be able, in time, to aggregate all the information you want to know about which projects are happening. Which projects are happening where, in what capacities, what lessons are being learned, and what are the implications for scaling the successful efforts. Where are things not working and why, so that course corrections can be made. And I thought to try and bring this to your mind, I'd like to spend another 5 minutes just to present an example of where this is working in practical terms. Now, my choice of the example is really because my team have been involved in working with this country. It's very different from Myanmar, but it is also, in 2011, launched something called the Agricultural Transformation Agenda. It happens to be the largest growing economy in Africa. It happens to be the country called Nigeria. It has a population of somewhere between 170 and 180 million. It is a federal system where it has a federal capital territory which houses the federal ministries, and it has 35 states, all of which have their own and independent governments. And so we have been working with trying to measure the performance of the agricultural transformation agenda in Nigeria using this approach. Now, it's really important that you understand that the idea is to actually identify how do the interventions of the Nigerian government get measured from grassroots all the way through state ministries into a federal ministry in order to report against the performance of this agenda. This agenda is about growth in the agricultural sector. It's about replacing oil as the major economic growth sector in Nigeria. It's about creating, between 2011 and 2015, 20 million metric tons of additional food in the domestic food supply, and another 3.5 million rural jobs. It is very much about taking agriculture as a business and developing it by giving it access to inputs and supporting outputs through markets and infrastructure. If we were to talk about a collective vision, and these are words that were created by
a Nigerian team drawn from the policy and planning and coordination team within the ministry. It's about transforming Nigeria's agriculture to self-sufficient local food production. The inference there is about import substitution, particularly for wheat, to create wealth for farmers, catalyze agribusiness and rural jobs, use innovative investments, targeted infrastructure and enabling policies and value chains that are inclusive for women, youth, and that have nutritional priorities within them, and to use evidence to make better decisions. So these are the impact domains in Nigeria: increasing food security, nutritional improvement. Much of that relates very much to agriculturally sensitive nutritional messaging, such as biofortified crops, better protein sources from animal and fish, and also increasing rural income growth, improving agricultural export earnings and trade more generally, reducing imports on food, and employment and job creation. And this pink one here is an outcome that the ministry themselves has set for themselves because of the reforms and restructuring that has gone on as part of the reform process internally. Intermediate outcomes are really related to things that we understand: efficiencies in agricultural production, improvements in yields through agricultural productivity, reduction in pre- and post-harvest losses, particularly by about a target of 50% by 2015, agricultural improvements in the efficiency of agricultural extension, increases in production, and improved adoption. If we consider the sorts of priorities in their system, these are the crop value chains. There are 17 in total, including leather, that are the principal focus of the agricultural transformation agenda. In addition to them, we have things called the Growth Enhancement Scheme. It's an interesting scheme that uses mobile telephones to provide access to farmers to fertilizer and seed that is subsidized by government. It is the first time in 40 years that the control of fertilizer has been taken out of the state government's hands and has been put into the hands of agribusinesses. And therefore the private sector is beginning to drive this. At the moment they have 10 million farmers who are in receipt of the Growth Enhancement Scheme in a particular number of value chains. They have focused on rural jobs, particularly the kinds of jobs that Tom Reardon talked about, and they have got staple crop processing zones, including agribusiness hubs, to ensure that they can substitute things like wheat in their bread making and use things like cassava flour and so on, and also create manufacturing industries by using cassava to create sugars, starch, various components like that. Gender, agricultural extension and nutrition are all embedded in here, so there are particular targets that relate to those things in terms of being able to facilitate sectoral change. I mentioned this linear theory of change. The reality is that it's actually more complicated. Each and every actor plays a role in the system, and they also engage with one another in combinations that we may not know about. So in order to make this tangible, the line ministries themselves, from each of the 11 line ministries, created a series of actor maps for each of those value chains that I mentioned. Those actor maps really look at grassroots level outcomes that they are pursuing. Again, remember, at the state level, because these programs are being run in the states, they're not being run in the federal capital territory where the federal ministry sits. And so understanding the changes that they are attempting to support and how information about the success of those changes begins to translate up are very key components. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. So if we take the fish value chain, there are 3 principal actors for the government: artisanal fishermen, fish farmers who are growing and rearing fish, and processors. And there are particular changes that they are all pursuing in relation to what they want to see. Now those changes start to translate. This is another one for rice, small-scale farmers growing larger amounts of rice. There are ways in which those initiatives and the actors start to contribute to the intermediate outcomes and the high-level outcomes. And if I go into a little bit more detail, you can see that for any particular outcome, you can start to map which value chains are going to make specific contributions to food security, to agricultural export earnings, for example, and so on. And what we need to focus on is a minimum number of common harmonized indicators. Our tendency is to try and collect more and more data because I think it's analogous to us looking smart, but actually we don't look so smart in the end because we don't know what to do with that data. And there is an awful lot of emphasis on the quantity of data rather than the quality of data and understanding that data. For the Nigerian Ministry of Agriculture, here are the value chains. Here are the key outcome domains, and here are each of the value chains. Now, at each of these value chain levels, there are a number of initiatives which have some cross-cutting involvement, and each of those value chains happens at the state level. And so we are currently doing an audit of what the IT capacities are of the key value chains in the states that those value chains have been prioritized in, to understand what capacity do state governments have to collect evidence, and what capacity do they have to store and transmit that data to federal ministry. And how does federal ministry work? By ensuring that it helps to ensure that the data and the analysis actually reaches grassroots level, state level government, local government, down to village level in terms of what's working and what's not working. And so that is a program that is currently underway. Just to give you an idea of how you identify common indicators, for each of the value chains and each of the actor changes in those value chains, there are indicators that are identified, their source, who collects them, through which tools, how frequently, who processes and analyzes that data, who uses it, and where it needs to go in terms of the principal user, are all identified. So it's very systematic. Everybody understands clearly what they need to be doing. I'm not going to go into detail here, but here are some examples of those frameworks populated. And here are some of the questions for that fish value chain that members of the ministry themselves articulated. So for example, they want to understand through their knowledge management portal, how will the capacity of state level actors be enhanced to do KM and M&E? How can KM and M&E support the state level ATA, Agricultural Transformation Agenda, work? How will the fate of ATA without legal framework, that really relates to the fact that there are general elections starting at the end of February. But there are some very compelling factors here, that they are currently running the agricultural census to form a baseline for all of this information now. That agricultural census data is 22 years out of date. And so it provides a fantastic baseline to be able to show change under this initiative. Here, there are also opportunities related to the more recent agricultural census data. Okay, so finally, I just want to leave you in mind with a couple of things. It's important that you all understand the investment in monitoring, evaluation, and knowledge management. It does require some skills and capacities related to quality data collection. You must have heard many times, if you've got rubbish data going in, you're going to have rubbish analysis coming out. Systematic M&E pays off, but it's important to measure the minimum that is part of that common vision, to use it and learn from it, and that evaluations are guided by that internal focus on data capture and management. In the absence of it, evaluations are just a one-stop shop, snapshot in time. They can't really tell you how change happens or over what period or how sustainable or scalable it is. Using an agile approach to the software means that you're not spending vast amounts of money creating institutional networks of ICT platform. You are testing the approach as you go, you are making sure it's fit for purpose and it works. It's giving you the evidence you need and the analysis that helps you to make better decisions. And it will help to build accountability between implementing partners and their beneficiaries, because information needs to flow down to farmers about what's changing in the agricultural sector, what opportunities can they take advantage of. And very often that component is forgotten in the mix of things. So just when you thought it was getting simpler, let me leave you with that platform approach. And thank you very much for your attention.